ground shook before the shells arrived. That was the thing veterans remembered first, not the sound, not the fire, but the trembling beneath their boots. A low, rolling vibration that moved through the earth like something ancient waking up. Then came the sound, a tearing roar that split the sky open, and then the world in front of you simply ceased to exist. This was the Canadian way of war, not improvised, not desperate, methodical. Precise, relentless in a way that German officers would later struggle to describe in their after-action reports. Because how do you explain to a high command that the enemy doesn't stop? That their guns don't cool, that their timing doesn't slip, that no matter how well you've dug in, no matter how thick your concrete, the shells keep coming and they know exactly where you are. By the middle years of the Second World War, Canadian artillery had become something the German Wehrmacht had not anticipated when they first encountered troops from across the Atlantic. They had expected colonials, enthusiastic, brave perhaps, but raw, improvised fighters from a country most German staff officers couldn't place precisely on a map. What they found instead was a machine. A gunnery machine built on doctrine, training, mathematics, and a command philosophy that gave forward observers the kind of authority that even British gunners didn't fully possess. A system that could place steel on a target faster than almost any other Allied force in the Western theater, and sustain that fire longer with greater accuracy, and with less hesitation than the enemy believed possible. This is the story of how Canada built that machine, how it was tested, refined, and ultimately unleashed across the battlefields of Northwest Europe, and how the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, veterans of the Eastern Front, defenders of the Atlantic Wall, came to understand, too late, that the quiet Dominion to the north had quietly become one of the most dangerous artillery powers on Earth. To understand what Canadian artillery became, you have to understand what it was built against. The German defensive doctrine of the Second World War was not static. It was layered, adaptive, and designed specifically to absorb punishment. German commanders had studied the lessons of the First World War more carefully than most. They had watched fixed lines collapse under sustained bombardment on the Western Front. And they had built their defensive philosophy around avoiding that trap. Defense in depth, elastic defense, withdraw under pressure, counterattack when the attacker is extended and exhausted. Hold the second and third lines, not the first. Make the enemy pay for every 100 meters, bleed them forward. It was a doctrine that had worked well in North Africa. It had slowed the British at El Alamein. It had made the Italian peninsula a grinding nightmare for the Allies. And when the Germans prepared the defenses of Northwest Europe, the Atlantic Wall, the towns and ridgelines of Normandy, the waterways of Belgium and the Netherlands, they built those defenses with the same layered logic. What the doctrine did not adequately account for was an artillery force that could follow you into the depth. Traditional artillery support had limitations that experienced German commanders knew how to exploit. Guns took time to register targets. Forward observers needed line of sight or pre-surveyed positions. Requests for fire had to travel up a chain of command before they could be approved and acted upon. In that window, the gap between a target appearing and shells arriving on it, a skilled German commander could move his forces, pull back, regroup. The Canadians closed that window, not overnight. Not from the beginning. The Canadian artillery system that emerged by 1944 was the product of years of painful learning. Some of it earned in blood, some of it developed in training depots and staff colleges in England, and some of it simply the result of men who refused to accept that the old way was the only way. The story begins, as so many Canadian stories of this war do, with a disaster. Dieppe, August 19, 1942. The raid on the French port of Dieppe was, by any honest accounting, a catastrophe. Of the roughly 5,000 Canadians who crossed the Channel that morning, nearly 900 were killed, and over 1,800 were taken prisoner. Entire regiments were destroyed on the beach before they could advance a single meaningful step. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Essex Scottish, the Royal Regiment of Canada. Names that would mark gravestones from Dieppe to the veterans' memorial walls back home. The operational reasons for the failure were multiple and interconnected. Inadequate fire support. Lost surprise, cliffs that intelligence had underestimated, tanks that couldn't cross the shingle beach, communications that collapsed almost immediately. But the lesson that Canadian artillery officers carried away from Dieppe, the lesson that would shape everything that followed, was specific and brutal. You cannot advance infantry without destroying what is waiting for them. And you cannot destroy what is waiting for them if your fires are late, imprecise, or too brief. At Dieppe, the preliminary naval bombardment had been compressed to avoid detection. Air support had been inadequate. The artillery that landed with the assault troops had almost no time to set up before the battle overtook them. The result was infantry moving into prepared defensive positions that had been barely touched. That would not happen again. In the months and years after Dieppe, the Canadian Corps reorganized, re-equipped, and operating under commanders who had internalized those lessons at a cellular level, began building a different system. It was based on a simple but demanding principle. Every request for fire support should be honored rapidly and accurately, and every soldier in a forward position should have the ability to call it down. The instrument of that principle was the Forward Observation Officer. The FOO, as he was called, was not unique to Canada. Every army in the war used artillery observers. But the role that Canadian doctrine assigned to the FOO, the authority it granted him, and the speed it expected of him, was different in ways that mattered enormously in practice. In most armies, a forward observer identified a target and submitted a request through channels. That request would be evaluated, approved, and then transmitted to the guns. The process had checks built in. It had hierarchy. It took time. In the Canadian system, the FOO operated with what modern military doctrine would call a direct link to fire authority. He moved with the forward infantry, often in the most exposed positions on the battlefield, carrying a radio set that connected him directly to his battery's command post. When he identified a target, he called for fire and the guns responded. The gap between observation and impact was measured in minutes, sometimes less. This sounds simple. It was not. It required gunners trained to extraordinary standards of accuracy. It required communication procedures that worked under fire. It required commanders at every level who trusted the man at the front more than they feared the risk of expending ammunition. And it required a culture within the artillery itself, a shared understanding that the job was not to protect the guns, but to support the infantry. That culture had to be built deliberately. And it was Lieutenant General E.L.M. Burns, who commanded the 1st Canadian Corps in Italy before moving to Northwest Europe, was one of several senior Canadian officers who pushed relentlessly for a more aggressive, more responsive artillery doctrine. Burns was not a charismatic commander in the popular sense. He was methodical, sometimes cold, often difficult. But on the question of firepower, he was uncompromising. He understood, in a way that not all commanders of his generation did, that artillery was not a support asset. It was the primary weapon of modern war. The infantry, in this vision, existed to move through the destruction the artillery created, not to overcome it on their own. Not to rely on courage and bayonets where shells should have done the work first. The guns themselves were, by mid-war, an impressive force. The standard Canadian field artillery piece was the 25-pounder, a British-designed gun howitzer that had become the backbone of Commonwealth artillery across every theater. It was not the heaviest gun in the Allied inventory. It was not the longest ranged, but it was versatile, accurate, and could be brought into action quickly. A well-trained Canadian crew could unlimber a 25-pounder, lay it on a target, and fire within minutes of arriving at a new position. Medium and heavy regiments complemented the field artillery with larger weapons, 5.5-inch medium guns, 7.2-inch howitzers, and by the Normandy campaign, self-propelled artillery that could keep pace with armored advances. The Sexton, a self-propelled 25-pounder mounted on a Canadian-built ram tank chassis, gave Canadian armored formations artillery that could move with them, shoot on the move if necessary, and keep the pressure on a retreating or counterattacking enemy without waiting for towed pieces to be brought forward. The Sexton itself was a story of Canadian industrial ambition made practical. Designed and produced in Canada, it entered service in 1943 and would serve with distinction through the Italian and Northwest European campaigns. It was not glamorous. It looked from the outside like what it was, a modified tank hull with a gun mounted in an open-topped box. But it worked, it was reliable, and it was there in the numbers that mattered. Numbers were, in the end, part of the story. By the time the 1st Canadian Army crossed into Northwest Europe and began its campaigns in Normandy and the Low Countries, it had concentrated artillery at a scale that reflected both the lessons learned and the industrial capacity of a nation that had devoted itself entirely to the war effort. A single Canadian corps might deploy dozens of artillery regiments, field, medium, and heavy, capable of concentrating hundreds of guns on a single target or dispersing them across a wide frontage in an hour. The concentration of guns on specific targets, what artillerists called a stonk or a murder, could be organized within minutes once a target was registered. A German position that was identified at 900 might cease to exist by 9:15. It was in Italy that the system first demonstrated what it could really do. The Italian campaign was, from beginning to end, an attacker's nightmare. The peninsula's geography was a defender's gift, river after river running perpendicular to the Allied axis of advance, each one backed by ridges that the Germans could defend with small numbers of men, because the terrain funneled any attack into a narrow corridor that every gun on the ridge could cover. The Gustav Line was the worst of it, running across the width of Italy south of Rome, anchored on the mountain town of Cassino and the heights of Monte Cassino. It was perhaps the most formidable defensive position in the entire Western theater. The Germans had spent months building it. They had tunneled into hillsides, concealed their artillery in reverse-slope positions, and created interlocking fields of fire that made every approach a killing ground. The 1st Canadian Corps arrived in Italy in late 1943 and was assigned to the 8th Army under General Harold Alexander. Their first major action would be the assault on the Hitler Line, a secondary defensive position just north of the Gustav Line, in May 1944, as part of Operation Diadem. The Hitler Line was, by any definition, a formidable objective. The Germans had spent considerable effort building it: concrete bunkers, Panther tank turrets set into reinforced emplacements, interlocking fields of anti-tank guns and machine guns. The defensive position had been designed specifically to stop the kind of armored assault the Allies favored. What it had not been designed to withstand was what the Canadians brought to it. In the days before the assault, Canadian artillery conducted a preparation that was, even by the standards of the Italian campaign, exceptional. Every identified position on the Hitler Line was registered. Counter-battery fire suppressed the German guns. Medium and heavy artillery targeted the concrete emplacements directly. The timing of the preparation was worked and reworked by artillery staff officers who understood that the moment the guns lifted, the infantry would be moving. On May 23, 1944, the assault went in. The 5th Canadian Armored Division led the attack, with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade in support. The initial assault ran into fierce resistance. The Hitler Line was deep enough that the preliminary bombardment had not destroyed everything. But the Canadians had something the Germans had not fully anticipated: the ability to call down immediate, precise fire on positions that were holding up the advance. FOOs moved with the leading companies. When a Panther turret emplacement opened fire and stopped a platoon cold, the call went back and shells arrived before the Germans could reposition. When a machine gun nest in a concrete bunker pinned down a company in the open, the request for fire was answered in minutes rather than hours. By afternoon, the Hitler Line had been breached. By evening, the Canadians were through it. The position that German commanders had calculated would hold for weeks, or break the offensive entirely, had fallen in a single day. The German defenders were not poorly trained. They were not short of ammunition. They had fought with the discipline and determination that the Wehrmacht consistently brought to defensive operations throughout the war. What they had not anticipated was an adversary who could bring fire to bear so quickly, so accurately, and with such relentless continuity, that the tactical advantages of their prepared positions were progressively stripped away. There is a human dimension to this that the operational accounts sometimes miss. The FOO was, in many respects, the most dangerous man on the Canadian battlefield. He had to be forward enough to see the targets, which meant forward enough to be seen in return. He worked from tank turrets, from the upper stories of shattered farmhouses, from shell craters on open ridgelands. His radio set was his lifeline and his death sentence simultaneously. German snipers and machine gunners knew that men with radio antennas were priority targets. The casualty rate among FOOs in the Italian campaign was sobering. But the men who filled those positions, regiment after regiment, understood what they were doing and why. They were the link in the chain that made everything else work. Without the FOO, the guns were blind. Without the guns, the infantry died. Captain Herbert Westmacott of the Royal Canadian Artillery described the work in a letter home that somehow avoided the censors. You are always cold and usually wet, and the ground is never flat and you can never stand up. But when you bring a battery down on something that needed hitting, when you see the result, you understand why you're doing it. The boys up front are counting on you. That's not abstract. That's the man next to you counting on you. This was the arithmetic of artillery in the Canadian system. The man at the guns was serving the man at the front. The man at the front was trusting the man at the guns. And the doctrine, the training, the communication procedures, the authority granted to the FOO was the mechanism that made that trust operational rather than sentimental. By the time the Canadians crossed from Italy to northwest Europe, the bulk of the 1st Canadian Army had spent the Italian campaign there. While a separate force prepared for Normandy, the artillery doctrine had been battle-tested to a degree that few Allied formations could match. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Juno Beach was the Canadian sector, and the Canadians hit it in the middle of the first wave. The naval gunfire support for the Normandy landings was, by any measure, massive. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lined the channel and threw fire at the coastline in the hours before the assault. But naval gunfire, however powerful, has limitations against small, dispersed defensive positions. Bunkers designed to fire laterally along a beach rather than out to sea often survived naval bombardment. Machine gun nests in reinforced concrete could absorb tremendous punishment and still have crew alive inside when the firing stopped. At Juno, as at every beach that morning, the naval bombardment lifted as the landing craft approached. The moment when suppression was most needed was the moment when the guns had to stop, for fear of hitting their own men. What the Canadians had that partially offset this was self-propelled artillery mounted on landing craft, guns firing from the water as the infantry ran toward the shore. It was imprecise by the standards of registered artillery fire, but it provided something: noise suppression. The psychological weight of shells arriving on the defenders at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The assault companies at Juno suffered serious casualties in the first minutes on the beach. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifle Regiment, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, they all ran into machine gun and mortar fire that had survived the bombardment. Men died in the water and on the sand, but they did not stop. And once the infantry was off the beach and into the defenses, the artillery system that had been developed through years of doctrine and battle began to function. Tanks came ashore. FOOs with the leading companies began calling targets. The guns, field, medium, heavy, were following the assault force ashore, and within hours of the landings, Canadian artillery was operating on French soil and supporting a forward advance that, by the end of June 6, had pushed farther inland than any other beach sector. Bernières-sur-Mer, Courcelles, Bagny-sur-Mer. Names that Canadian soldiers passed through that afternoon, moving inland through a Normandy that the German defenders had not fully expected to yield so quickly. The Normandy campaign that followed was long and grinding. The hedgerow country of the bocage did not favor the attacker, and the Germans defending it were good soldiers with good equipment and a defensive doctrine perfectly suited to the terrain. But the Canadians were learning something in that country that would prove decisive later. They were learning how to coordinate artillery and infantry in terrain where visibility was almost non-existent, where every hedgerow concealed a potential anti-tank gun. where the distance between your position and the enemy's might be 20 meters of dense vegetation. The answer they developed was more aggressive use of the FOO, pushed even further forward. It was tighter coordination between artillery fire and infantry movement, what the Canadians began to call the creeping barrage refined for bocage conditions. It was willingness to call fire closer to their own positions than orthodox doctrine recommended, because the alternative, advancing without fire suppression, cost more lives. It was, in a word, audacity. But audacity grounded in confidence, confidence that the guns would be where they needed to be, firing when they needed to fire, and accurate enough that the infantry could keep moving. German commanders in Normandy began noting in their operational reports something that their intelligence had not predicted. The Canadians, particularly those of the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, did not behave like the colonial troops the pre-war assessment had categorized them as. They were not reckless. They were not easy to break with a counterattack. They did not advance without fire support, and when they called for fire support, it came, and it was accurate. One German prisoner captured near Caen in July 1944, a veteran NCO who had served on the Eastern Front, told his interrogators, "The Canadian artillery does not sleep." It was not a metaphor. The Canadians had established standing fire plans for the night hours, not simply defensive fire tasks, but active harassment of German assembly areas, supply routes, and communication centers. While other formations stood down in the dark hours, Canadian guns continued to fire, keeping German commanders uncertain about where the next assault would come from, and preventing the rest that defensive forces needed to maintain their effectiveness. Exhaustion was a weapon. The Canadians used it deliberately. The liberation of the Scheldt Estuary in autumn 1944 was perhaps the supreme test of everything the Canadian artillery system had built. The Scheldt was not a glamorous operation. It did not have the cinematic drama of a beach landing or the clean strategic clarity of a breakthrough. It was a grinding, miserable, months-long struggle through flooded polders, mud, dikes, and flooded farmland, against German defenders who had been told and understood that holding the Scheldt meant denying the Allies the use of Antwerp's port, which they needed desperately to sustain the advance into Germany. The terrain was as bad as anything in the entire Northwest European campaign. Water was everywhere. Firm ground was narrow and predictable, which meant the Germans knew exactly where the Canadians had to come. The polders, low-lying farmland reclaimed from the sea, now flooded by German engineers who had opened the sea dikes, meant that movement off the few solid roads was often impossible. Artillery in this environment presented unique challenges. Gun positions flooded. Ammunition resupply was slow. Forward observation in terrain with no elevation, flat, open, waterlogged, was dangerous almost beyond description. The Canadians solved it. They used Oster spotter aircraft, small, fragile observation planes that flew over the German positions and radioed corrections to the guns below. They coordinated with the Royal Canadian Navy's river craft, which provided floating gun platforms in some of the flooded channels. They built specialized approaches to the forward gun positions, sometimes laying metal roadway across submerged farmland to get the sextons to where they needed to be. The German defenders of the Scheldt, many of them from the 15th Army, men who had been trapped north of the Seine after the Normandy breakout and brought across the water to hold this position, were not expecting to encounter the level of fire support that descended on them through October and November of 1944. The South Beveland Peninsula fell. The island of Walcheren, the key to the Scheldt's mouth, was taken in an assault against flooded and fire-swept causeways that cost the Canadians dearly but never stopped. By the end of November, the Scheldt was clear. Minesweepers moved in. Within weeks, the port of Antwerp was operational, and the Allied logistical crisis that had been slowing the advance since the breakout from Normandy was resolved. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had not always been generous in his assessment of Canadian performance, acknowledged publicly that the Scheldt operation had been essential, and that the 1st Canadian Army had accomplished what no other formation in the Allied order of battle had been positioned or equipped to do. The German High Command, reviewing the Scheldt campaign in its aftermath, concluded that the Canadian artillery, operating in conditions it had no right to function effectively in, had been the decisive factor in breaking the defense. Prepared positions that had been calculated to survive anything the Allies could bring to bear had been systematically destroyed, suppressed, and neutralized by fires that came from directions and at densities that the defenders had not anticipated. The lines had not held. They never held against the Canadians for long. There is a tendency in the histories of the Second World War to discuss artillery in the aggregate, corps-level preparations, army-level bombardments, thousands of guns, millions of shells, acres of destruction. The aggregate is real. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the Northwest European campaign, the 1st Canadian Army fired more shells per rifle company than almost any comparable formation. The volume of ammunition consumed, artillery ammunition, not small arms, but actual explosive artillery rounds, represented a manufacturing and logistical achievement that stretched from the factories of Ontario and Quebec to the gun parks of Belgium and the Netherlands. But the human story is smaller than that. It is the FOO in the forward slit trench, lying flat on cold mud, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching a German MG-42 position tear apart a platoon he has been moving with for 3 weeks. It is the moment he keys his radio, gives a grid, waits, and hears the crack of the guns behind him. It is the silence after the shells land, and the tentative movement of men who are still alive and moving forward because someone saw what needed to be destroyed and had the system to destroy it. It is the battery commander at his command post, calculating time of flight and angle of fire by flashlight in a half-ruined barn. Running the numbers again because 1 degree of error at 5,000 meters means shells landing on his own infantry. It is the gun crew, 4 men around a sexton in the gray half-light before an attack, loading, traversing, checking, loading again. Hands black with propellant residue, ears ringing. Loading and firing because that is the job and the job does not stop. This was the machinery of Canadian artillery at war, not impersonal, not mechanical despite the machines. Human in every part of it, and dependent on human skill, human trust, and human willingness to keep doing the job regardless of what was happening around them. What the Germans encountered in the Canadian artillery, ultimately, was the product of a specific national moment. Canada in 1939 was a country that had entered the war not from desperation, but from choice. It was a country that had watched the previous generation destroyed in a war that had left deep scars, in the soil of its farming communities, in the silence of its churchyards, in the faces of men who had come home from Ypres and Vimy Ridge, and the Somme and never quite returned. It was a country that had no territorial ambitions, no empire to protect in the immediate sense, no existential threat at its borders. It had come to fight because it believed that fascism, unchecked, would destroy the world it wanted its children to inherit. That belief was not abstract. It was expressed in the factories, in the training depots, in the careful construction of a doctrine that was designed not to win glory, but to save lives. Specifically, the lives of the Canadian soldiers who would be asked to advance across defended ground. The artillery doctrine was, at its core, a humanitarian project as much as a military one. Every refinement in FOO technique, every improvement in communication procedure, every additional gun registered in support of an attack, all of it was designed to reduce the number of young men from Toronto and Winnipeg and Halifax and Vancouver who would die in Norman orchards or Belgian floods. The Germans experienced that doctrine as relentlessness, as a refusal to be stopped, as an enemy whose fires seemed to anticipate their movements, whose guns never seemed to exhaust themselves, whose artillery did not rest while their own men needed rest. What they were experiencing was a country that had decided it was going to do this right, that it was going to build the best artillery system it could, train the best gunners it could, give those gunners the best doctrine it could, and send them into battle with the full understanding that their job was to bring every Canadian soldier home, that it was possible to bring home. That it was not always possible, that the casualty rolls were long and the names on the memorials are real, does not diminish the intention or the achievement. The Canadian artillery saved lives it is impossible to count precisely, because those are the lives of men who advanced and survived, because a target was hit before they reached it. The final battles of the Canadian advance, the Rhineland campaign, the liberation of the Netherlands, the drive to the North Sea, saw the artillery system operating at its peak. Operation Veritable, launched in February 1945 from the German-Dutch border, was preceded by one of the most concentrated artillery preparations of the entire Northwest European campaign. Over 1,000 guns opened simultaneously. The ground shook at distances far removed from the front line. Rivers of flame and smoke rose into the winter sky over the Reichswald forest. German defenders who survived the preparation described it in terms that veterans of the Eastern Front found difficult to categorize. One officer of the 84th Infantry Division wrote afterward, "We had been shelled before. We had been bombarded by the Soviets, but this was different. This was systematic, every position. Every road junction, every possible route of movement. There was no place on the map that was safe. No place on the map that was safe. That was the Canadian artillery system in its mature form. Not chaos, not random destruction. A systematic, methodical application of firepower to every point where resistance was possible, planned by staff officers who had spent years refining the art, executed by gunners who had spent years mastering it, and corrected in real time by FOOs who moved with the infantry through the devastation they had created. The Rhineland fell, the Rhine was crossed. The Netherlands was liberated, village by village, canal by canal. At the cost of Canadian blood, but with the support of Canadian guns that the Dutch civilians who had survived the occupation would not forget. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the 1st Canadian Army occupied a front that stretched from the North Sea coast to the German interior. It had done more, with the forces available to it, than any objective assessment of its resources would have predicted. The artillery was a large part of why. There are things that do not appear in the operational records. The sound of a 25-pounder battery firing in full concentration, a sound that has been described, by men who heard it, as physically painful at close range, as something that enters the chest and resonates in the skeleton. The smell of cordite at a gun position after a prolonged fire mission, acrid, chemical, settling into clothing and hair and skin. The particular silence after a fire mission ends, a silence that is not actually silent, because the ringing in the ears fills it. The feel of a radio handset in a cold hand, pressing it against an ear while the world around you tries to kill you, waiting for the guns to answer. These are the things that do not appear in the staff papers or the operational histories or the tactical assessments that German commanders filed with their superiors. These are the things that happen to real men, Canadian men, who built a system and then lived inside it at every level. From the chief artillery officer at Army headquarters, to the ammunition handler at the gun park, to the FOO in the forward slit trench. Their work changed the shape of the war. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of thousands of fire missions, tens of thousands of rounds. Hundreds of engagements, in which the target that needed to be destroyed was destroyed before the men advancing toward it arrived. The Germans thought their lines would never hold against the Canadians. By 1944, they were right. The lines did not hold. And the reason they did not hold was not mysterious, not miraculous, not a matter of luck or superior numbers alone. It was doctrine, it was training. It was a country that had decided, with the full weight of its industrial capacity and the careful thought of its military minds, that if its sons were going to cross defended ground, they were going to do it with the best fire support that human ingenuity could devise. That was the Canadian artillery system. That was why the lines did not hold. And in the Netherlands, in the spring of 1945, old men and women and children who had been hiding for years came out of their houses and onto the roads and stood in the mud and the cold and watched the Canadian soldiers pass and wept. Not because the war was over, because someone had come, because someone had built the machine and learned how to use it and aimed it at the right targets and kept it firing until the job was done. The guns of the 1st Canadian Army fired their last operational rounds in May 1945. The FOOs who had called down those rounds, the ones who survived, came home to farms and cities and small towns across a country that did not always know what to ask them. The doctrine they had refined, the system they had built under fire, became the foundation of Canadian artillery thinking for a generation. The Sexton's self-propelled gun served in Canadian service until 1956, the 25-pounder until 1967. The men who served those guns aged, and most of them are gone now. But the ground they crossed, the ground in Normandy, and the Scheldt and the Rhineland that they prepared with their fire and their skill, and their willingness to keep the radio open and the guns hot. That ground remembers what was done there. And in the village squares of the Netherlands, the flags still fly in May.